everyone, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in to study some Jewish history together. So tonight we're continuing to talk about the response that the Jewish people had to the tumultuous events that we have been discussing in previous sessions of the 17th century, the 16th century, etc., etc. And we discussed one revolution last week that took a large segment of the Jewish people in Western Europe away from traditional Judaism. Tonight we're going to talk about a revolution within traditional Judaism, and that is the Hasidic Movement. Now, the Hasidic movement starts primarily in Eastern Europe, and it really is responding to a lot of these same things that led to the Reform movement, the need for the Jew to better their situation in the world, the need for the Jew to improve on the downtrodden state that they had. And if things had gotten quite complicated in Western Europe, they were all the more so terrible in Eastern Europe. Because at this point in Eastern Europe, what was going on was the Polish Empire that had basically been a decent place for the Jews to live for a couple of centuries. Well, the Polish Empire was now on its decline, and the Russian Empire was on its ascent and was going into their imperialistic generations, their imperialistic times. And as Russia was conquering many of the areas where Jews resided, the result wasn't very good. The Jews were just the most downtrodden of society. They were treated okay by the Polish, but much worse by the Russians, and we already discussed before how they were treated by the Ukrainians. So throughout Eastern Europe, the plight of the Jew was quite terrible. So Hasidus comes into this situation and also aims to make the situation for the Jew much better than what it was before. Now, what's interesting is, like any revolution, there's opponents to the revolution, and there's going to be an out-and-out war that will break out between the Hasidim and the establishment, and in the end, it will end somewhat peacefully. Yes, there are those who argue that the war is still going on today, but it was really over by the mid-18th century. And in the end, both sides basically come to a resolution. But at the time of the fight, it is definitely a bitter fight, and there's a lot of casualties to the fight. Now, as we look at the sort of the protagonists in this fight, they're often referred to as, on one side, the Hasidim, who are the people of the revolution we're talking about tonight, and on the other side there are the Misnagdim. Now, if we just look at what these terms translate as, the word Hasidim means the pious ones. Chasid means pious in Hebrew, so the Hasidim are the pious ones. Misnagdim means the opponents, right? There's the pious ones and there's the opponents. Now, who do you think came up with these terms? There's a number one rule in debate that I mention quite often, that you never want to use the term of your opponent, because when you use the terms of your opponent, you're already conceding a point. For example, in the discussion of the modern day state of Israel, there are a lot of terms that the media will use, that the Arabs will use, that imply that the Jews don't really belong in Israel. For example, referring to Judea and Samaria as the West Bank, as if it's the West Bank of Jordan, the West Bank of the Jordan River, the west part of the Jordanian Empire, all implying that the Jews don't belong there. The war that took place in the early 2000s is often referred to as the Intifada. Intifada in Arabic means shaking off filth. We call it the Oslo War. But so too in this discussion of the Hasidim and Misnagdim, I myself am not a Hasidic Yid, I'm not a Chassid, I am a Litvish Yid, I'm a Lithuanian-style Jew, and I will never refer to myself as a Misnagid, because I'm not an opponent, I don't oppose anything, I don't oppose Hasidus, I'm not in opposition to anything, and I will challenge anyone who would refer to me as a Misnagid. Now yes, maybe sometimes it's a joke, I'll call myself a Misnagid, but I think it's a term that needs to go away. It's not an appropriate term anymore nowadays. But at the time, the Hasidim referred to themselves as Hasidim and their opponents as Misnagdim. So just so we know some of the terms and where they come from, and like I said, I don't feel that the Hasidim call themselves Hasidim. We call them Hasidim now for 300 years. Fine, it is what it is. But to call the non-Hasidim in the world Misnagdim is not appropriate anymore, frankly. Okay, so This is what we're jumping into, this terrible situation for the Jews, the dire poverty of the Jewish people, Russia not treating the Jews well, and it just gets to the point where the Jews are really just need something to change in Eastern Europe. Now, beyond the threats from without, there were threats from within, because in Eastern Europe at this point, the establishment, the aristocracy of the Jewish people also wasn't doing much for the downtrodden. And there was a tremendous gap between the haves and the have-nots within the Jewish community. And not only that, but up until this point in the Jewish world, the Torah learning was paramount, as it still is, and therefore either you were a scholar or you were garnished. You were nothing. There was no in between. If at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old you didn't show potential in Torah learning, you were sent out to the fields to work. You were sent to work in the family business, whatever it was, and you didn't have a chance. Later on, and just think about that in modern terms, like how many kids really develop and really blossom and come into themselves in their teenage years, in their post high school years. When they go to yeshiva, they burn off. They go to yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. They might burn off steam for a few years and then become tremendous scholars. And how in this time in Europe, you're written off already by the age of 10, if you weren't showing promise in your learning. And there was nothing. It wasn't like now we go to school till you're 18. You might go to yeshiva for a few years and then you'll go out to work. No. They went out to work at 10. So there was a tremendous gap between the scholars and the Amharatzim, so to speak. So all of this made for a lot of animosity even within the Jewish world. So all of these winds that were blowing in Eastern Europe are what will bring in the Hasidic movement. So the story of the Hasidic movement starts in the year 1698 when there is a man born by the name of Yisrael, and he is eventually referred to as Yisrael Baal Shem, or the Baal Shem Tov. He is born in the city of Akop, which is part of modern-day Ukraine, near the Ukrainian/Romanian/Moldovan border in the southwest part of the Ukraine, and he has a life very similar to what we've been talking about that many had in this part of the world. He's an orphan already from the age of 5, and from that point on, he goes from family to family, town to town, and is really on his own from the age of 5. He's not known as a scholar. He's in the workforce by the age of 12. He was known as a dreamer, as someone who would go out for long walks in the woods, and was not recognized for any greatness as a child. Now, basically, what we know about the early days of the Baal Shem, and really all we know about the Baal Shem period, is what comes down to us from from one of his main Talmidim, Rav Yaakov Yosef of Podoi. He wrote a book called Toldos Yaakov Yosef, in which he accounts the history of the Hasidic movement in the early years of the Baal Shem Tov, and all this comes from him. So are these legends? Are these fact? We don't really know for sure, but as Rabbi Berelwein always says, one thing we know is they don't tell these stories about you and me. Okay, so the Baal Shem, not known as a scholar, but what Rabbi Yaakov Yosef tells us is that in fact he was definitely a scholar, and he did it in hiding. In other words, he would be up all night studying when everyone else was sleeping, and before everyone else woke up, he'd go into bed so people would think he was asleep the whole night, and then he'd sleep a few minutes and get up, and it was in those days that he became the tremendous scholar, both in what we call Torah's Nigla, in the revealed Torah, and also in Torah's Nister, and the Kabbalah. Now, even though Kabbalah had really, the revolution of the Ari had started about 200 years before this, it initially was only in the Sephardic world, and after the debacle of Shabtai Tzvi was very much looked down upon, but at this point it was at least a known quantity, a known entity within the Ashkenazi Eastern European world, and the Baal Shem and his secret learning became not only a Torah scholar of the revealed Torah, but a Torah scholar of Kabbalah as well. Now, Kabbalah will play a very big role in the Hasidic movement, which, by the way, will be part of its the red flag that it'll send up, because this revolution is going to take place within 100 years of the Shabtai Tzvi debacle. And the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, as we mentioned before, Kabbalah was looked at as a factor that led to that debacle. So a lot of the challengers of early Chassidus, they fear that it's going to be another Shabtai Tzvi debacle, because a lot of the things that Shabtai Tzvi talked about are a lot of the same things that the early Chassidim talk about. The difference is the Chassidim are sincere about it, and Shabtai Tzvi wasn't, but that only plays out later. So furthermore about the early life of the Baal Shem, we know that he married and he became a widower within his first year. His wife passed away within the first year of marriage and without children. And eventually he remarries and has children. And around the age of 18, it starts to become clear that he is actually a scholar. And he starts to become a teacher of Kabbalah. He's the head of a Kabbalistic study group, and it starts to be regarded as a holy man. He starts to travel around as a holy man and gain a certain amount of notoriety. Now, at the age of 36, in Kabbalistic thought, the age 36 is very significant, 2 times Chai. This was the year 1734, and at this point, the Baal Shem finds himself in the town of Mezbitchitz, or Mezbitchitz is one of those words that's always hard for us to pronounce, but Mezbitch, as a lot of people call it. And he has a vision that he is to bring the ideas that he has been working on, he has been developing. He has a vision that he is to bring this to the world. And that year 1734 is regarded as the beginning of Chassidus. Mezbitchitz is regarded as the capital of Chassidus, happens to be where the Baal Shem Tov is buried today. And from this point on, he begins to take his message of Chassidus to the world. Now, what was the message of Chassidus? The message of Chassidus was a progressive form of Judaism. Now, it's interesting that today, for people who aren't really familiar with the Hasidic community, we don't think of the Hasidim as a very progressive branch of Judaism. Now, we're going to discuss why they got that image, but in the 1700s, it was very progressive because they were bringing ideas into the Jewish world. They were very new ideas. As we said before, up until this point in the Jewish world, scholarship, Torah learning was everything. And there was nothing else for people to connect. Now the Hasidim brought all kinds of different philosophies and ideas to help people to connect outside of Torah learning. For example, the concept of dveikus. Dveikus in Hebrew means clinging to the Almighty. Now, the idea had been talked about in a lot of Kabbalistic works beforehand, but it became a focus of Chassidus, clinging to the Almighty. And the idea was that through meditation, through nature, through hisbodedus, through just trying to connect to the Almighty in a spiritual way, that you could connect. And beyond this, the Chassidim really upgraded the place of prayer within Judaism. And they, not to say that it wasn't important before this point, but they put it, let's say, on par with Torah learning. They put prayer on par with Torah learning. So not everybody could be a great Torah scholar, but everybody could pray. And the Chassidim said that you should do whatever you need to in order to prepare for a proper prayer, for proper connection to the Almighty. So, for example, Jewish law says you have to pray the morning service within the first 4 hours of the day. Well, the Chassidim said, well, if you can't pray in a way that gives you dveikus, that gives you real connection to the Almighty, pray in the 5th hour, pray in the 6th hour. The afternoon service, mincha, is supposed to be prayed before sunset. The Chassidim said, again, if you can't connect before sunset, connect after sunset. With this, so to speak, almost completely throwing out a section of the Talmud and Brachos and what's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. But they went on, even further, that if you need a l'chaim before daven, well, have a l'chaim before you pray. The Baal Shem Tov brought the idea of going to the mikveh very much into practice for Jewish males, that they instituted going to the mikveh every single day in order to prepare for prayer. And if you need to jump up and down to pray with intent, jump up and down. If you need to scream, if you need to cry, if you need to holler, if you need to throw things, it didn't matter. And in Chassidus, whatever you need to do to pray, you do. And whatever you need to do to connect, you do. And that was very new because at this point, prayer was like something you had to do, but it was quiet, focus thing. And no, the Chassidim said whatever you need to do to bring out your heart in prayer, that's what you do. Now, one of the things that became very common amongst Chassidim was the idea of singing during prayer. Now, I know nowadays you go into a synagogue on Shabbos or the holidays, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a synagogue that doesn't sing during davening. Even many of the Lithuanian-style yeshivas do a good amount of singing during davening. That was an invention of the Chassidim. It did not exist in the Jewish world, the concept of singing during prayer. Now, yes, in the base of Mikdash, when the temple stood, the Levim there was a singing in instruments and a band that accompanied the korbanos, the offerings in the temple, but that never translated it into the synagogues in the exile until the Hasidim come along. The Hasidim come along and start this concept of singing during davening. And that's going to be one thing that will definitely catch on throughout the whole Jewish world. Now, just to show how the institution of singing took a little bit of time in some places, I'm a student of Yeshivas Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, and Ner Yisrael had a world-famous mashgiach by the name of David Kronglas Zatzal, who was a student of the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai and in Europe. And when he first came to the yeshiva, when the yeshiva started, it was a Lithuanian-style yeshiva. There was no singing during davening. But over the years of the yeshiva, there were some Hasidic students that came, most notably the famous Twersky family, the Rebbe from Milwaukee, and eventually and his brothers and his children. Many of them learned in Yeshivas Ner Yisrael. And when they came to the yeshiva, they sort of, encouraged some Hasidic customs. And one of the things that they won over was to start singing Lechadodi. Now, again, like I said, go into a shul today that doesn't sing Lechadodi, it's hard to find. But here, this was what I think the 60s or the 70s in the yeshiva, and they got the yeshiva to start singing Lechadodi. So the Friday night that it started, Rav David Kronglas got up and walked out of the yeshiva. He's like, this is not my Judaism. But B'nai it's something that everyone does nowadays and is a Hasidic institution. And now another thing that the Hasidim did in trying to convey these Kabbalistic ideas and to bring them down to the layman, they did it through parables. If you've ever heard of the concept of a Hasidic Maisa, a Hasidic story, that was the tool that the Hasidim used to teach these lofty ideas of Kabbalah to really anybody, and to really try and bring up all people to a very high spiritual level. Now, beyond this, the Baal Shem Tov, or stories started to circulate about the Baal Shem Tov as himself being a miracle worker. Now, this is also going to be one of the things that's going to make the early Hasidim come under fire, because no rabbi or scholar or leader of the Jewish people had claimed to be a miracle worker before this point, except for people like Shabtai Tzvi and Jesus. But no one had claimed to be a miracle worker since pretty much since the times of the Tanakh, the prophets. Okay, maybe the Tanaim a little bit, but definitely in about 2,000 years, there had not been any legitimate Jew. Like I said, there have been illegitimate Jews like Jesus and Shabtai Tzvi and a few in between who claim to be miracle workers. But now there's someone who's claiming to be a legitimate Jew who is claiming to do miracles. And that's going to be another thing that's going to raise the red flag. But stories started to circulate about the Baal Shem Tov healing the sick, healing the blind, and this will play into those Hasidic shemaises, the Hasidic stories and the Hasidic parables. Now, there's a concept that really helps to uplift many people at this time, because as we mentioned before, not everyone could be a scholar. And even though prayer was put on a higher level, up on par with Torah learning, that was also hard for some people to connect with. So the Hasidim came up with another concept, and it was a concept called the Rebbe. Now, Rebbe is just like a Eastern European way of saying the rabbi, or Rebbe, which means my rabbi. But the concept was this, that at least in the first generation, the Rebbe was the Baal Shem Tov. And we're going to see that he has two descendants, and then it'll spread like wildfire from there. Now, the concept was that not everybody could be a scholar, not everybody could be a tzaddik, not everyone could be a righteous Jew, but just by connecting to a Rebbe, so to speak, you could ride to heaven on his coattails. So, in other words, just by having a connection to Chassidus, a connection to the Baal Shem Tov, even if you couldn't reach that level yourself, you were going to be uplifted through his actions. Now, again, this is a concept that was revolutionary in its time. It is not a concept that exists outside of the Hasidic world. And to many, it sounded strikingly similar to a lot of Christian theology. So that also is part of how the Hasidic movement comes under fire at the time when the war really breaks out between the Hasidim and the opponents. Now, there's other smaller things that happen. Like there's something called Hasidic Shechita, which exists until this day, and that is that until this point in Jewish history, traditionally a Shechita knife had always been made out of iron, and the Hasidim changed it to be made out of steel. They felt the blades are better, the blades are sharper, the Shechita, the slaughter could happen quicker, and that was also a point of contention that came up. So nowadays, when you go to your kosher supermarket and you buy kosher meat, you'll see that sometimes it has written on it that is Hasidic Shechita, and that basically means that a steel knife was used as opposed to an iron knife. A few other differences, but that's the main thing. Now, There's another thing that until this very day, and it's probably one of the main differences nowadays in 2022 between Hasidim and Misnagdim, Hasidim and non-Hasidim, and that is that Hasidim wear a very particular style of dress. Now, it happens to be that Hasidim wear a style of dress based on whatever Hasidic dynasty they're part of. For example, you might think they all wear long coats and streimlach. Well, you might notice, there's different type of streimlach. There's some that are big streimlach, small streimlach. There's some streimlach that are synthetic, called spuduks, that are a little bit taller than streimlach. There's some Hasidim that during the week they wear a flat hat, other ones wear a taller hat, other ones wear regular pants, other ones wear knickers with stockings. Again, a lot of different styles of dress, with certain variation, and that usually is based on the different dynasties that they come from. Now, a lot of times we get the question, what's with the Hasidic dress? Now, here's where, even though the Hasidim were a progressive, new age, radical movement, they also put certain stopgaps in. In other words, we're going to see that as the Hasidic movement develops, that there is so much assimilation that will come even to Eastern Europe now. Now, it's not there at the beginning of the Hasidic movement, but it'll come by the mid-19th century in something known as the Haskalah. And what the Hasidim will do to try and, so to speak, stand up to this assimilation is they will become very, very insular. So if you ever wonder why certain Hasidic communities have a reputation of being very insular, well, that is a philosophy of the movement. That in order to protect ourselves, to inoculate ourselves against assimilation, we're going to be a very closed community. And hopefully through that, we'll be able to protect ourselves. And what came hand in hand with that was taking the style of dress that Jews wore at that time. Now, we're talking about roughly the 18th century. And again, like I said, it varied from the town of Satmar to the town of Gura to the town of Alexander, whatever town it was, the town of Vizhnitz. The dresses differed, but they were similar. But they said, whatever we're wearing right now, this will be our dress mikan ve'elech, from this point forward and future. And that's essentially where the concept of the Hasidic garb came from. That really at that point, at least in Eastern Europe, all Jews, whether they were Hasidim or whether they weren't Hasidim, all Jews wear long coats. Many Jews, whether they're Hasidim or non-Hasidim, wore streimlach, wore fur hats. The Vilna Gaon, the great opponent of the Hasidim, wore a streimel. In fact, today in Israel, it's very difficult sometimes to tell just by the way someone is dressed if they are a Hasidic Jew or a Litvish Jew or a Jew in the way of the Vilna Gaon, because the students of the Vilna Gaon who will settle parts of the land of Israel at the same time as the Hasidim settle parts of Israel, well, they also kept the Eastern European dress. So today you'll see someone wearing a streimel on Shabbos and a white bekashe like the custom is in Jerusalem, and just by that dress alone, you don't know if they are Hasidic or if they are descendants of the Vilna Gaon. You don't know, because they dress exactly the same in Jerusalem, because that's how all Jews dressed in Europe. That was a dress that was brought to Israel, and whether the Jews were Hasidic or non-Hasidic, the dress was kept in Israel. Outside of Israel and Eastern Europe, non-Hasidic Jews, their dress, we'll see with the Muslim movement, will change into wearing very similar clothes to non-Jews, but the idea of wearing whatever the respectful dress is of the time, that's what the concept of the Muslim movement, of the dress the Muslim movement became, and we'll talk about that when we get there in the next week or two. But the Hasidim paused the dress, the long coats, the furry hats, and the streimlach, the biba hats or the weekday hats, the streimlach or the Shabbos hats, and that was looked to be a way to inoculate themselves against assimilation. And to a certain extent, it worked. Now, there's another thing that became very common amongst the Chassidim, at least in the bigger communities, is the bigger communities often had big synagogues, and obviously those synagogues were often ruled by the establishment. And as much as the Chassidim tried to get in there, they were often kept out by the establishment. So what did they do? They said, we don't need the central synagogue. We'll open a shtibel. Now the concept of a shtibel was just a small synagogue, usually in someone's house, not with the big fancy buildings that were often built for synagogues, and that was also a tremendous disruptor, because like what do you mean you're not going to daven in the city's synagogue in the building that we all built, that our father prayed in, our grandfathers or great-grandfathers built? What do you mean you're not going to pray here? Just going to open some little prayer shack down the street? So yeah, what do we need a big fancy building for? Well, we'll open our shtibel, which just meant, the word shtibel means like our small little place. And that was the concept that, again, exists in certain ways until today of the Hasidic shtibel. A lot of times Hasidic synagogues, even though they'll be big and beautiful beautiful nowadays. They'll call themselves a shtibel, which really means like a small little place, because that's going back to the concept of where a lot of these Hasidic synagogues started as being these little breakaways from the mainstream synagogues. Okay, so that's a little bit of the philosophy of the. And again, I'm not telling the whole story. I'm just telling general, painting broad strokes over here. But those are a lot of what was happening in this first generation with the Baal Shem Tov of the Hasidic movement. Now, what's interesting is nowadays the Hasidic dynasties are completely dynastic. In other words, when a Hasidic Rebbe, when a leader of one of the dynasties passes away, the only ones in consideration for his successor are his sons. If he didn't have children, sometimes it'll be a nephew, but oftentimes if there's more than one son, that'll lead to a strife or a split, and that's how we got a lot of our different Hasidic groups. There's one major one, unfortunately, going on right now with the Gerach Hasidim. When we were in Israel for my daughter's chasana, for my daughter's wedding, I was taking my parents on Motzei Shabbos on Saturday night after Shabbos Sheva Brachos to get their COVID test to be able to leave the country, which at that point you still needed, and we got caught in a whole protest, in a whole fight that was going on between the Gerach Hasidim, which is one of the largest groups of Hasidim, especially in Israel, because they're having now some dissension as far as an older brother, a younger brother, who the real leader should be. But anyways, when the Baal Shem Tov passes away, it is not dynastic at this point at all. The Baal Shem Tov did have children and had grandchildren, and they do not become the second generation of Hasidic leaders. It was at this point very much in the theme of Hasidus. If they had become dynastic, that would have gone to a lot of the issues they were fighting, because the people that were attracted to Hasidus were the downtrodden people, the people who had not made it in the Jewish establishment. So to be able to now come and say, we're going to be dynastic, that would not have worked with the movement. It was a complete meritocracy. And the two main successors of the Baal Shem Tov that really keep the movement going were not his children, but they were two men by the name of Rav Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, who is known as the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. That was one of the main works that he wrote about the Baal Shem Tov and gave us a lot of the information we just discussed. And it was really the first Hasidic book, if you will. And the other of the main students of the Baal Shem Tov was Radov Ber ben Avraham of Mezerich, who is known as the Maggid of Mezerich. Now, while the Toldos Yaakov Yosef is known for writing down a lot of the early ideas of Chassidus, the Maggid of Mezerich is really the one who's given credit for spreading Chassidus throughout Eastern Europe, throughout Poland, Ukraine, Russia, the western part of Russia, and the term Maggid is a term given to someone who really spreads an idea. And this is what the Maggid Mezrich does. He takes the idea all over Eastern Europe, and the idea will spread to the masses. It'll spread like wildfire throughout all different parts of the Hasidic world, and to the point, all different parts of Eastern Europe, to the point where the only parts of Eastern Europe that will not be Hasidic within a few decades will be Lithuania and modern-day Belarus, which was at that point basically part of Lithuania. That'll be the enclave that will fight Hasidus, and virtually everywhere else in Eastern Europe, Galicia will be the mainstay. Galicia, Poland, much of the Ukraine, much of the Romania, much of Russia. All of these places will become really overtaken by the early Hasidim. Now, what's interesting is if that's the situation, and Eastern Europe was where most of the Jews were at this point, and the Hasidim completely take over. Well, why is it today that Hasidim are not the majority of the Jewish people? And they aren't. I mean, there's some big Hasidic dynasties. There's definitely several 100,000, maybe 500,000 Hasidim in the world today. But why are we not all Hasidim if so much of the establishment had been taken over by the Hasidim in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews were? And the simple answer to that is, unfortunately, Hitler Yamach Shema wiped out most of the Hasidim, because many of the Hasidim do not leave Eastern Europe. They stay to ride. They think they're riding the storm of Hitler. They think somehow they'll be protected. And again, we'll talk about that more when we get to it. I'm not judging that at all, and I never want to judge that because like the question always is when these anti-Semitic uprisings and pogroms and genocide in the case of Hitler, when they pop up, is the question is, well, where are you going to go? Where else are you going to go? And we'll discuss that question when we get to it. But at least at this point, with Maggid Mezrich and his subsequent students, the concept and the idea of Chassidus will spread like wildfire. So second generation, you just really have two main leaders, Rav Yaakov Yosef of Ponoi and the Maggid Mezrich. But the descendants of the Maggid Mezrich will be the ones that make all our Hasidic dynasties as we know them. Again, they will splinter out many times over, but a lot of the main ones will be the students of the Maggid Mezrich. So when we talk about, for example, the Satmar Hasidim, the Ger Hasidim, the Alexander Hasidim, a lot of these Hasidim will be those will start within that third generation. The Lubavitcher Hasidim, the Chabad Hasidim, a lot of those will be that third generation of the students of Hasidus, the students of the Maggid of Mezrich. Now, one thing about the names of the different Hasidic dynasties, for the most part, the names of the dynasties are the towns in Europe where they started. For example, the Satmar Hasidim came from Satamara in Romania. The Ger Hasidim came from Gora Kalavaria in Poland. Now, the funny thing about that name is Gora Kalavaria means the Calvary Mountain, which is a reference to the mountain that Yashka was crucified on. So it's kind of funny that you have this group of the Ger Hasidim that are named for the mountain that Yashka was crucified on. But that's the town they came from. I once heard someone wanted to say that the Satmar, coming from Satumare in Romania, that meant Saint Mary, but that does not mean Saint Mary in Romanian. It means the little town. I looked it up. That's what it means in Romanian. So it's not. It does not mean Saint Mary. But at least with the Ger Hasidim, it means Calvary Mountain, which is a reference to the mountain that Yashka was supposedly crucified on. Anyhow, but Lubavitch, that was the town of Lubavitch. Alexander was the town of Alexander, etc., etc. It was always the name of the town that they came from, and they go all over the place. They take over this part of the world. Now, I want to say a little bit about the opposition. Now, we're going to talk about the opposition a little bit more. We'll talk about it in general strokes now, and then next week, as we start to talk about the development of the yeshiva and the development of the yeshiva movement, the Musar movement, we'll understand the opposition and the fights that go about. But the fights, like anytime there's a fight, you have the establishment will fight a revolution. They try to stomp it out. They put them in a chayrum, and those things never work. That usually only aids the revolution, and that is very much the case with Hasidus. Now, but the establishment that was fighting Hasidus, like we said, was because they saw a lot of sentiments and a lot of winds blowing very similar to the Shabtai Tzvi debacle just 100 years before. So again, a heavy emphasis on Hasidus, heavy emphasis on Kabbalah, this idea of the miracle worker that the Baal Shem Tov was supposed to be, sort of breaking away from the establishment, and a lot of people got concerned, and frankly, for good reason, because the Shabtai Tzvi debacle was a terrible debacle. Now, the difference was, we got to emphasize this point, the Shabtai Tzvi debacle was led by Shabtai Tzvi, who was not sincere, and the Hasidic movement was led by the Baal Shem Tov, who was very sincere, and his students were very sincere, and even though certain things look similar, at the core, the goal was to really revitalize Judaism in a major way. But unfortunately, the fight that, as the Baal Shem Tov says, it'll play out in 100 years, and it did. It's over by the mid-19th century. But it was a brutal fight at its time. There were definitely, it got physical at times. Both initially the opponents and then later the Chassidim themselves will appeal to these secular governments to get involved, and that's never a good thing. And it is not a good fight. But eventually it'll calm down, because by the mid-19th century, many of the ideas of secularism will come to Eastern Europe in the form of the Haskalah, as we said before. So the Hasidim and their opponents will realize they have a common enemy in assimilation, and they should put down their fight for the betterment of the Jewish people, and they do. Now, what's also interesting that a lot of people will point out, and I've had different people within the Hasidic community argue with me on this point, but I think there's some truth in it, and that partially because the fight to a certain extent is a fight lishma, and we'll see and there's definitely lo lishma, there's definitely negative elements of it, but the main person behind the fight will be the Vilna Gaon, the great Vilna Gaon, who we'll talk about soon, and there'll be others like the Noda B'Yehuda and others that will also be part of that fight. But they're sincere in their fight, and the people in the Hasidic movement who are really the ones who are fighting the fight, because really it takes the fight. it comes to a head in the third generation. So people like one of the main people in the fight is Shneur Zalman Ladi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, who tries, the Magen Mezritch tried, and Shneur Zalman tried to meet with Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon wouldn't meet with them. But there's a concept that I once heard from Rabbi Beryl Wine, where he said what ends up happening is that what's good about the Hasidim rubs off on the Litvaks, and what's good about the Litvaks rubs off on the Hasidim. And there's a lot of truth to that, because, for example, when we talk about the yeshiva movement, well, the Hasidic movement will also adopt the yeshiva movement. When we have, and that hasn't happened yet. That will happen in the Lithuanian world, and that will be adopted by the Hasidic movement. And there are many of the Hasidic customs that will be adopted by the Lithuanian movement, the yeshiva movement, so to speak. Like I mentioned before, singing and davening on Shabbos and Yantiv. Everyone does it nowadays virtually. And even beyond that, there's a lot of other customs that we'll see. For example, anyone who gives their kid an upshirin, the concept of not cutting a boy's hair till his third birthday. Hasidic custom didn't exist before the Hasidim at all. And a lot of Lithuanian Jews do it. We did it with our son. My wife comes from Hasidic stock, and that's part of why we did it. But many Lithuanian-style Jews do that. And there's a lot of other things that have rubbed off. So to the point where I think that while there are still differences between the two communities, like we said, even today, the Hasidic community is still much more insular than the Lithuanian yeshiva-style community, and the dress obviously is different. But when you talk about the yeshivas and the customs, they're very similar. It reminds me of the great A.B. Rottenberg song on one of the A.B. Rottenberg's one of the great Jewish singers of our generation, and he has this great song on I think Journeys 4, I believe it's on, where there's a Hasidic Jew who's living next door to a Sephardic Jew, and they're just going to ignore each other because they're so different, and then they realize that they sing the exact same Zmiros, the exact same Shabbos songs, and through that they form a bond, and they end up becoming the best of friends, and the Hasidic guy by the end of the song is eating couscous, and the Sephardic guy learned Yiddish, and it's a very funny song, but that's I think what ended up happening, is there was a certain amount of rub-off from one to the other, and well, to a certain extent the communities are somewhat separate today, at least in certain places they're a lot more intertwined, especially in Israel, for example, where you walk into the major yeshivas in Israel, like the Mir Yeshiva especially, and there's many Hasidic Jews in the Mir Yeshiva today, and therefore, to a certain extent, I think we can say that the fight has passed us by. And we're at the other end of that. Now, just another word to mention on the fight and the struggle between the establishment and the Hasidim is the Lubavitch Hasidus, the first Lubavitch Rebbe, the Shneur Zalman of Ladi. He sets a goal of trying to intellectually fight the war, and therefore he writes a book to intellectually defend the complaints against Hasidus, and he does it with a lot of Kabbalistic thought, and that is a book known as the Tanya. Now, the Tanya is a deeply Kabbalistic book, very hard to understand. It's actually very strange to me today. No offense to anyone watching, but the Chabad Hasidim, the Lubavitcher Hasidim today, believe that everyone should learn the Tanya. And I always find that so interesting because it's such a complicated book to understand at any level. But that's what they do. He also wrote the Shulchan Aruch Harav. He wrote the Code of Law according to the Hasidim, just to show that this was not a movement that was going to be moving away from Torah learning. And it's kind of interesting because today the Lubavitcher Hasidus is not really known as a one that focuses heavily on Torah learning, but at least at their core, definitely at the time of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's known as the Alter Rebbe, Shneur Zalman Ladi, they were very much the pillar of Torah learning within the Hasidic movement, and it was his writings that really focused a lot of that energy. Now, one last thing that I want to point out is that the Hasidim really reinstilled the hope of Mashiach within the Jewish people. It had been kind of stomped out 100 years ago after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, and the Hasidim brought it back to Eastern European Jewry. It became a big part of the Hasidic focus. Unfortunately, to the point where in some groups of Hasidim, it led to really messianic movements. Where in modern times we've seen Hasidic groups who claim that their Rebbe, their leader, is the Messiah, even after he died, which is not a Jewish idea. But it really did bring back the idea of yearning for Mashiach, which is a fundamental Jewish idea. It's one of Rambam's 13 principles of faith. It was brought back to the Jewish world, to the Eastern European Jewish world, through the Hasidim. So as we said, the war does take 100 years. It plays out. The Hasidim will win in numbers. Unfortunately, many of those numbers will be completely wiped out in the Holocaust. But at least in its time, it won out. And then when it comes to rebuild the Jewish world after the Holocaust, it's really going to be rebuilt. There'll be many Hasidic dynasties that will rebuild. The Samar Hasidim, are the largest Hasidic dynasty today, over 100,000 strong, and they rebuilt from nothing, from literally a few thousand who survived the war, if even that. And Ger Hasidim, same story. Vizhnitz Hasidim, Chabad Hasidim, all the same thing, all rebuilt after the war because virtually all their followers were wiped out, except for a few who were able to come and rebuild the Chassidus. And then the Lithuanian rebuild. Again, when we get there, we'll talk about the Lithuanian world rebuilding as well. And but this is what we see happen with the Chassidim, and this is what we see happen in its time. And in the end, like I said, while it was a fight and a revolution at its time, it definitely becomes a true, holy, mainstream way to observe Judaism as it is today, and something that we should all look at with admiration. And that's the beginning of the Hasidic movement. We'll talk about them a little bit more as we talk about this next chapter, Tumultuous Times. Next week, God willing, we'll talk about the Yeshiva movement and then the Musar movement, which will be the next response to the winds that were blowing in the world at this time that helped to revolutionize the modern world and to define the world that we all find ourselves in today. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next week.